So good day, everyone. I'm Karen Bonadio, Senior Director of Alumni Relations, and I'm delighted to welcome you to today's Alumni Talk Policy webinar, After Dobbs, the Future of Women's Health. The Alumni Talk Policy webinar series features HCAS alumni and panel discussions about pressing public issues. This webinar is being recorded and closed captioning is available. I'm happy to introduce the moderator, Siri Chilazi, MPP 2016, Research Fellow, Women in Public Policy Program, as we refer to as WAPPP, at the Harvard Kennedy School, who will kick off today's important and timely discussion. Thank you all. Siri?
Thank you so much, Karen, and hello, everyone. We are so pleased to have you here joining us for this important discussion. Like Karen mentioned, I'm a member of the MPP class of 2016 myself and have had the pleasure for the last several years of working as a research fellow at the Women in Public Policy Program at HKS. Today, we are going to dive into the policy implications of the Dobbs decision overturning Roe v. Wade in the United States. And as you can imagine, those implications run deep and they exist on many different levels. While a lot of people perceive abortion to be a political issue, we will treat it today as a health and economic issue. As you will hear from our esteemed panelists, whether abortion is legal and available has important implications for all people who may become pregnant, and our ability to decide if and when we want to have children has enormous implications also for our financial circumstances. I want to also underscore that this goes for both women and men, as well as people who don't identify on the gender binary, because being forced to become a parent to a child when you are not prepared for it or don't want to do it is enormously disruptive to everybody's lives, not just women's. So with that framing, allow me to introduce you to our fabulous panelists today. Rosemarie Day is the founder and CEO of Day Health Strategies, a successful mission-driven consulting firm celebrating its 12th anniversary. She helped lead the launch of health reform in Massachusetts, which became the model for the Affordable Care Act nationwide here in the United States. And she authored Marching Toward Coverage: How Women Can Lead the Fight for Universal Health Care, published in 2020. Rosemarie is a mother, a breast cancer survivor, and an activist. Welcome, Rosemarie. Next up, we have Wanda McClain. She is a former healthcare executive with expertise in promoting health equity, access to care, and community health while expanding diversity, equity, and inclusion. Wanda currently serves on strategy and she currently consults on strategy and organizational processes focused on ensuring equity for populations affected by persistent disparities. Wanda serves as the chair of the Planned Parenthood League of Massachusetts and on the boards of the Planned Parenthood Federation of America, Inc., Fallon Health, and the Dymox Center. And finally, last but definitely not least, we have Dr. Neel Shah, MD, MPP, who is the Chief Medical Officer of Maven Clinic, the world's largest virtual clinic and first unicorn technology company for women's and family health. He's also a visiting scientist at Harvard Medical School, where he previously served as a professor of obstetrics, gynecology, and reproductive biology. So without further ado, I want to start the conversation with these incredible experts. Rosemarie, let's start with you, and let's start with something very topical and recent, which is the midterm elections here in the United States. It's pretty clear from the results that abortion indeed was on the ballot. So what are your reactions to what we saw happening about a month ago?
Two words: democracy worked. I think there were a lot of pundits who were kind of despairing of what was happening in the run-up to the election. But I think if you look at what happened in the summer in the vote in Kansas, where abortion was on the ballot, Kansas being a pretty conservative state, and people turned out in droves, a lot of first-time voters who were there to protect a woman's right to choose. And we saw that carry through all the way into the midterm elections, where abortion was on the ballot, and 6 out of 6 initiatives, abortion rights prevailed, and that voters indicated that that was a key factor in how they were voting, both for those initiatives and also for a lot of the candidates. So, but that did not happen without an awful lot of effort to raise the awareness and to turn out the vote. And I think we can speak more about that, and particularly in the Kansas experience. So this is something where, women are very woke on this issue, I guess to say, but it's not just women. It's a lot of young voters who are turning out, men and women, and voters of color. And so that is something, again, the pundits were saying, oh, inflation and all this. It turns out people can kind of hold competing stressors in mind and respond to what they're most concerned about. And I think it also came through in the Georgia election results that we just saw, where abortion was a top issue for those who came out and supported Senator Warnock. So I'm encouraged with the results that we saw.
Wanda, I see you nodding.
Oh, absolutely. I couldn't agree more. And I think that there was a fear that, to Rosemarie's point, that, that women couldn't walk and chew gum at the same time, but we could absolutely know that preserving fundamental human rights was on the ballot, and that we needed to focus on that. I think, in my role working with Planned Parenthood organizations, one of the things that I will say is that, as shocking as June 24th was to all of us, and I happen to be at a Planned Parenthood Federation board meeting on decision day. I can't think of a better place to have been, to be surrounded with people who like me are committed to this work, but it felt like a punch in the gut, right? We knew it was coming, but until it actually happened, the reality of it really, really set in. But the good news is that Planned Parenthoods and other rights organizations have been working and strategizing for a long time to be able to support people who needed access to what is life-saving healthcare, whether it literally will save your physical life or your mental life or your economic life. So I think what I will say is that for me, abortion is a human right. It is, we talk about it as being choice, and I think choice is an important word, but that doesn't do it justice. I think what we're really talking about here is a fundamental, inalienable, if I can quote our Declaration of Independence, life, liberty, and pursuit of happiness. All of those are wrapped up in a person's decision about when and where to start a family or not. So I will end it there for now.
And you mentioned something really interesting, which is the physical and mental health. Neel, as a resident doctor, could you shed some more light on that aspect of abortion access and rights? Sure.
I don't have a uterus, but as you said, it's a broader issue. I really, for all people who care about, as Wanda put it very well, the sort of fundamental right, and part of the, just understanding that I think needs to come with why it's so fundamental is from a provider's perspective. It's impossible to take care of people who are pregnant or who are capable of being pregnant without routinely encountering people for whom their pregnancy is psychologically excruciating or medically dangerous or just otherwise undesired. It is very, very common. And, beneath the very dichotomous public discourse around choice is the full context of people's lives, and a tremendous amount of nuance that I think we saw be a large part of really the chaos that was sown in the days that followed the Dobbs decision. I think the decision was rendered, but a lot of the harm actually was in the moment by moment confusion that it sowed in how to interpret the letter of the law and the ways in which it was really orthogonal in many cases to the duty to do no harm, truly do no harm in caring for people in real world situations.
So what is the current landscape for healthcare practitioners like you? And of course, this will depend on where healthcare practitioners find themselves in the country. But what are kind of the very practical on the ground challenges that you are dealing with now that you weren't dealing with before June?
Yeah, so first of all, I can speak from the perspective of a provider in Massachusetts, where Governor Baker signed a non-extradition executive order. What that means is that, in states like Texas, aiding or abetting an abortion, which is a very, it's an idea that can be interpreted in a lot of ways. It's not a lot of precision to aiding and abetting, right? You can be a back-end engineer at a telehealth technology company and be aiding and abetting. You could be a marketer, right? You don't have to be a provider, but aiding and abetting is a first-degree felony, which means that an activist DA in Texas could set a target and charge somebody. And we're in a situation in 2022 in America where Massachusetts needs to have a non-extradition policy to protect clinicians from not, I guess, being forced to face charges in Texas. So there's that kind of complexity, especially in a world in which I think accessing care and support digitally has become more normative. But then, fundamentally, there's a lot of care that is part of abortion care that has to happen in person. And broadly across the United States, I think on average, someone had to travel about 30 minutes to average an abortion. And now the number is 90 minutes overnight. And that's the average. Of course, there are parts of our country where people have to drive days, travel for, long distances. So.
And we actually have a map. I think somebody can probably post while we're talking about this topic, because it really brings it home, I think, to see the abortion deserts.
Yeah, and when you look at that map, one of the things that that you see is that if you live in the southern part of Texas, the closest place for you to access an abortion might be in New Mexico. And this morning, I just decided to Google like how long it would take you to get from not even the most southern part, but San Antonio to Albuquerque. It's over 1,100 miles. If you live in Louisiana, if you're in New Orleans and maybe you want to go to Chicago, that's over 900 miles. So when we are talking about issues of access, what we're talking about are people who may not have the option to do that because of either economic circumstances, and we know that bans on abortion impact low-income people and people of color more severely than others. So this is an equity issue in so many ways. And then, as Neel mentioned, the impact of those felony charges in a place like Texas, which also would go to the patient. So you are criminalizing, both providers and patients for accessing, healthcare.
And to amplify what Wanda's saying, I mean, we know that half the people in this country don't have $400 in savings, and an abortion, if you were paying out of pocket, could cost $500 or more, and that's not even counting travel time, lost wages, the mental anguish, all of the things that go with that. So it's an incredibly heavy burden. And also remember, if you are lower income and Medicaid is your coverage, many states have this thing called the Hyde Amendment, where Medicaid does not pay for abortion. So that is an out-of-pocket expense for you. And I would wager in most of those states in the bright red also correlate with being Hyde Amendment states. So it is, double, triple, quadruple whammy for women in these places.
Let's turn to another interesting policy implication, which is that for employers. So you mentioned, Rosemarie, if people are paying for abortions out of pocket, the cost can be very high. But a lot of people, of course, across the country are covered by employer-provided health insurance and various other healthcare-related benefits. What have we seen happening to employers in the wake of these decisions, and how are they responding?
So employers have been confronted with having to develop some kind of response about what they're going to cover, and particularly for companies that are headquartered, have a significant presence in these states that are colored bright red. So on a company by company basis, we are seeing some action. And yeah, about half the people in our country have some form of employer sponsored coverage, but that tends to be a whiter, wealthier, subset of our population, basically, that benefits from employers' coverage and from employers who will take a look and provide some alternatives, including potentially even a travel benefit if they need, if an employee needs to go out of state. So I'm glad to see that employers are stepping up, and I think Neel has probably more to say on this, but again, there's disproportionate impact in terms of who benefits from that.
Yeah, I agree with Rosemarie entirely. Also, my view on the United States of America has changed a little bit from being an academic that really saw health services in terms of medicated commercial lines. I mean, it's a uniquely American thing that we create insurance risk pools through employers. It's the basis of a lot of the fragmentation and limits and access in our country, but that's what it is, such that it is. And, it's typical in health services research to look at the commercial side and then the Medicaid side separately. As we should, it's different. Like, because of the Hyde Amendment, as Rosemarie said, there's a lot of places where you'd have to pay out of pocket. That being said, in my current role, I work with a lot of large American employers and small ones, but even among the large ones, you can be a technology business and still have people in fulfillment centers. You can be a bank and still have tellers. A lot of American businesses have people, especially in the new hybrid sort of world that we're all working in these days, which is probably why we have webinars now. Workforces are just distributed across the country. And it's created real complexity for employers that have got to figure out, the part of any kind of American corporation that is responsible for solutioning around something like this is the HR department. And HR departments are very sensitive to bottom-up pressure. They're not the CFO, they're not the CEO, but what they know is that they've got to retain and recruit employees and avoid employee complaints. That's their mandate. And, what we saw happen in Kansas that Rosemarie described, a version of that happened inside of American workplaces. And what we saw was that not only did a lot of employers have to not only take a stance on an issue that they normally wouldn't want to touch with a 10-foot pole, but they actually had to actively create solutions for their employees. So I found myself in the position of helping them figure out how to design benefits to support abortion care and even supporting them to reimburse travel, which is a new type of benefit that wasn't needed. I guess it's 6-7 months ago, but suddenly became something that many employers moved towards.
And how do employers in this complex scenario navigate the fact that the different states where they operate can have very different rules? Is there anything, I'm thinking of federalism, right? And how we have this two-tiered system in the United States, where on the one hand, states get to decide a lot of things for themselves, but then on the other hand, the federal government trumps states. How does that all play into what employers are dealing with?
I'm sure that both Rosemarie and Wanda have a perspective as well, but for really anyone who's span of control across the state lines, it's complicated. It always has been in the United States of America, but particularly on this issue, it's suddenly become very complicated. And it's not, there's complexity that's not even represented on that map, right? Because there's there's the Dobbs decision, and then there were trigger laws that I think some people heard of that went into place at the moment of the decision. Then there were these things called zombie laws, which literally the undead from 80-90 years ago just came back to life, that are really unmoored from modern understanding of how reproduction works. And it led to situations where people were in emergency rooms with ectopic pregnancies, bleeding profusely, and lawyers had to be consulted before clinicians could intervene. Even in cases where there were laws where there were exceptions made, quote, for the life of the mother, that's not something that's interpretable, clinically or legally, and really created a lot of complexity on the ground. So I think, that's part of why I think employers turn to companies like mine for support in just navigating that complexity. But I think, honestly, a lot of employers did not pay much attention to this issue until all of a sudden this happened, and were really caught on their back foot.
Yeah, I think that's true. I think that employers and corporations, I think, largely stayed out of this space until they had no choice. And, on that June day, when we were, reeling from the decision, one of the things that we stopped to talk about was how can we get American corporations, to pay attention and to become voices, and to recognize that, that they had a role to play, not only as employers, but as, quote unquote, citizens of this country. They had a role to play in protecting this fundamental human right. I also think, and Neel probably knows more about this than I do, I know that the American Medical Association also has come out, and they are, obviously going to be pro healthcare, but they have policies that oppose the criminalization of pregnancy, and they have stated that quite clearly. And they're trying to deal with the kinds of circumstances that Neel talked about, where people coming in to access healthcare, are forcing, where clinicians are being forced, to make a decision about protecting the life of the person in front of them and practicing good medicine, or reinforcing or being confused by bad laws. So we have created, the Supreme Court has created a nightmare scenario where people's lives are literally at stake. And, often when most people, when they think about abortion, they think about it in that, again, that context of choice, but, a woman who's having an ectopic pregnancy, this is not a choice issue. A person who's been in a car accident and needs, emergency surgery, but is pregnant, those are not choice issues. Those are issues of providing healthcare, and we have laws that say you have to provide emergency care, and so, is it now accept if it's a pregnant person? So I think, they opened a Pandora's box that they had no idea. And that's what's really sad and disturbing about this, that the people who made these decisions, who have been put in these places of power, did not do the basic kind of work to understand what the implications of this sea change would be on the lives of people.
Rosemarie, I saw you nodding as well, so if there's anything you wanted to add, go ahead.
So much to say. I think it's really important that the American Medical Association is taking this, because if you look at the folks who are against abortion rights, they're saying, oh, this kind of changes the politics, because it's one thing to go up against, be Planned Parenthood and be able to label some certain groups as being extreme. American Medical Association is not known as being extreme. In fact, they've tended to take more conservative, cautious views in the past. They've only recently declared that healthcare is a human right. So, it does change the nature of the on the ground politics, which is where this is going to play out for the time being, is at the state level. And even in the redder states, this does upset some of the dynamic if doctors start to say, I can't practice medicine the way I am supposed to, and I can't train people to practice medicine fully and completely. I think it's really important for doctors to be loud about this issue.
Yeah, just to double click on that, because Rosemarie called out my profession. I mean, I think the training cycle is short. It's like 4 years. And the way that people find their way into training as an OB/GYN, first of all, abortion providers are OB/GYNs for the most part, which provide lots of services. They deliver babies. It's the same people. And, there are a lot of people that are, if they end up in one of those states for their training, they're not going to be trained to provide a really basic service. And then in cases where they're already post-training, they're leaving because they can't practice. They can't fully practice, which just further exacerbates the disparity. And then just to also amplify some of the public health implications, we already have a maternal mortality crisis in the United States of America. An American today is 50% more likely to die in childbirth than her own mother was. A lot of reasons for that, but principally racism. Because if you're Black, you're 3 to 4 times more likely to die. And Wanda highlighted, as you look at that map, that places that are most impacted, I mean, the people that are always most impacted are the people who are made most vulnerable to begin with, but this really sits at the intersection of gender inequity and racial inequity and geographic inequity. It's like Black women in the South, they're going to be, and the estimate is that, you know, by the way, maternal mortality has been going up for about 25 years. The pandemic made it worse. And the estimate is that this may increase, the Dobbs decision alone may increase maternal mortality by as much as 20%.
Those are shocking statistics that certainly were new to me. What can we do to, I think the equity point of this is so poignant, right? All of us care deeply, but the impacts of the decisions are not even. Black women in the South are going to suffer the most. And they are already in the states that are kind of least accommodating of their needs, right, in terms of state level policy. So what are the strategies forward from here? What are we seeing and what are we not seeing yet that we should be seeing?
Well, I'll just jump in and say, changing the narrative and not demonizing and stigmatizing women who've had abortions. 1 in 4 women will have an abortion in their lifetime. And, you know, that means it's you or someone you know well, many people you know well. And that makes it a very personal issue. And because it's been stigmatized, it's this catch-22. People haven't shared the stories and made it normalized instead of stigmatized. So the narrative has to change about this. And that's how you know, inculcate that into the employer world, all of the places where people wanted to stay away from the politics of it. It's a human issue, and I think we have to humanize it. So people need to continue being courageous about sharing their stories to keep this, you know, salient and on the front burner until we restore the protections that we had under Roe v. Wade.
Yeah, and I also think that that, you know, and Rosemarie mentioned this earlier, and it was the political environment and the mobilization on the ground of people. We've seen it be effective not only in the overturning of those bans in those 6 states that were on the ballot, but even the election or re-election of Raphael Warnock shows that people, when they feel their rights are being infringed, and there was a story that looked at some of that election and said, trying to end Saturday voting, those voting right after Saturday, really mobilized people to come out and vote on that Saturday. And in particular, in the Black and Black community and people of color neighborhoods. So I think that this is the first time, at least from the data that I could see, that a right that we hadn't taken for granted, because we always knew that it was at risk, and you know, and that Roe was not the perfect solution either. But we had it for nearly 50 years. And, you know, I saw a quote by Doug Emhoff, the second gentleman, or I don't know if he's the first or second gentleman. I guess he's the second gentleman.
He's the first time there's been a second gentleman.
Our second gentleman.
He's the second gentleman. But he talked about how his 81-year-old mother has, you know, lived most of her life with a right that he doesn't exist now for his 21-year-old daughter. And that, I think, is exactly the kind of thing that will mobilize people. And again, it goes beyond, you know, the issue of my body, my choice. It's a fundamental, you know, human right. The other thing I just want to say is that we are going to go back to a place where women are going to self-manage their abortions, because at the end of the day, and I'm saying women, but all people with uteruses will self-manage if they have to. If it's a matter between whether their own lives, their economic life, they're going to make decisions that are going to be potentially leading to more death, more mortality. And so, the public health implications of that, even though there are safe alternatives and there are organizations that are really trying to help. And the last thing I want to say is Massachusetts. We're in Massachusetts. I have to say the fact that our governor, who is going to be leaving office soon, signed a law that protects clinicians from being extradited to other states, clinicians and patients, that also protected, provided access to contraceptive care and protected transgender rights. I mean, a lot of things were loaded into that legislation that is powerful and that shows the importance of having the right leaders in power at the right time.
And by the way, just to say, this is a Republican governor.
Exactly.
That was remarkable in and of itself, I think. I just also want to throw in, I think that there's becoming an increased understanding that you don't have to be pro-abortion per se. I mean, I understand that people can have deeply held personal beliefs about whether they would ever want to have an abortion, and that those beliefs can change over time. That's personal. I think what people are recognizing is that's for you to decide, not the government to decide. And that was a message that really played out well in Kansas about the notion of liberty and not having government determine your rights or your choices in that sense.
I think that there's a political insight in what you're saying, Rosemarie, and what Wanda was reflecting on as well, including in Doug Emhoff's sort of reflection on the generational difference between his grandmother and his daughter, which is that there's a broad side, and this relates to the question about solutions, because I think it starts here. There's a broad sense in our country right now that hope and opportunity are eroding generationally, right? Whether it's Make America Great Again or Build Back Better, both are tapping into this collective sentiment. And when, people are voting with their feet and things don't seemingly fall along political lines, whether it's a red state that's using a ballot initiative to fight back for abortion rights, or a Republican governor signing a protective order, I think it's also tapping into the sentiment that, generally speaking, we're not restoring something better. we're actually getting rid of a half century of access and a right. And I just think that's important, that sense of I think that really is the animating impulse for what's driving a lot of our politics. And I think that it does cross party lines, which is why it shouldn't have been that surprising, honestly. And it should be encouraging, actually, that whether it's in the next election cycle or even moving forward, that we can really galvanize people around this issue. I also think that a big part of it has to be the narrative, and part of what gives me hope is that it's really hard to construct a narrative without language, but there is new language in our lexicon that didn't exist in the same way a couple of years ago, as a result of not only widening need, but widening recognition of the need. We're not using as many euphemisms now. You can say racism as part of civil discourse. You can say systemic and structural racism, and generally speaking, people know what you're talking about. You can say abortion care in polite settings. And anyway, I think that of course it's not the whole solution, but I do think that the fact that you can walk into a corporate boardroom and talk about things on those kinds of terms is a sea change.
Yeah. This fascinating conversation could literally go on forever, but I want to make sure that we get the audience's voice in as well. So we're going to start with questions. I want to remind everyone that the webinar is being recorded, and I want to encourage you to use the hand raise function in Zoom at the bottom of your screen. Kristen Meservey will unmute you, or you will be invited to unmute and turn your video on when it's time to ask your question, and then you can ask it directly of all the participants, our panelists rather. We'll be using forum rules today, so that means that we ask you to introduce yourself with your name, your degree, and your degree year, and then ask a brief, succinct question that ends in a question mark, please. And as you're all getting ready to raise your hands, I wanted to pick up on one question that was previously submitted in the chat, and that is, don't late-term abortions also occur when the fetus is found to have no chance of viability? Neel, you can probably speak to this one.
Can you just repeat the question? Do late-term abortions occur? I don't think I understand it.
Yeah, so do late-term abortions occur also in cases where the fetus is found to have no viability?
Late-term abortions occur in cases where the fetus is found to have no viability. I mean, I think the term late-term abortion is a little bit of a misnomer here. I think there are a spectrum of reasons to terminate a pregnancy. And non-viability is a relatively common one. I mean, I think actually some of the imprecision of human reproduction has been part of what I think is being brought to the surface by this whole issue, is that, in the absence of intervention, a lot of pregnancies at various stages don't work out. And there is a need to manage those pregnancies for all kinds of reasons. For the health of the mother, mentally and physically, and then anomalies and complications can get recognized at various points along the way. So, is there a case where it would be necessary to terminate a pregnancy later on that's non-viable? Yes. And might that be the right thing to do? Yes.
And I think that was part of the governor's legislation here in Massachusetts, and there was a lot of debate. And I think it got complicated appropriately by the disability community, because of some of the language that was used about fetuses. But I would encourage that person to look at, some of the language in the legislation that the governor in Massachusetts signed.
And I think that also just highlights that, I mean, there is a real complexity and nuance to this. I don't want to make it seem like that's not the case. I think that, I think Rosemarie put it well, that there's probably a wide spectrum of personal beliefs on this issue that, again, are like very nuanced. They're not like pro-choice, pro-life, it's just truly complicated. And I think one thing that I've certainly learned in counseling thousands of people who've been in these situations is that it's unimaginable to sort of project at the policy level onto what people's circumstances might be.
This reminds me of some. Oh, please go ahead.
Well, I mean, just something that seems to not be well known or understood is that most women who have abortions already have at least one child. So they already know what it's like to carry a child to term and be, raising a child, and the amount of work and difficulty, frankly, that is, as much as we supposedly celebrate motherhood in this country, but we don't actually fully support it in any way, shape, or form. I just think, again, the issue got so stigmatized. It's as if you just sort of this willy-nilly young thing just being flighty. I don't know. There's like all kinds of messaging that has happened around this issue that's just wrong and needs to be counteracted with the real information and stories.
Yeah, well, I was actually going to say the very same thing. In my role as a gender scholar, I don't specialize in abortion, but there's other research showing, for example, that men with daughters have more gender equal beliefs and actually behave in more gender equal ways in their work, as, for example, lawyers and judges. And also Mahjarine Banaji, who's at the sociology department at Harvard, has psychology, pardon me, has shown that unconscious biases towards the LGBTQ plus community have significantly attenuated over the last 30 or so years, as more people have been publicly out and people have had more direct contact with, Joe the neighbor who happens to be gay, or your own transgender child. And so just to double underscore that point that you all have made about the importance of people sharing their stories more openly and the discourse being normalized, because I think a lot of people have mothers, sisters, perhaps even a spouse that they don't even realize have had an abortion. And if we understood truly how prevalent this is and how it's touched all of our lives, then perhaps some of those stigmas and stereotypes would fall away over time. There is another question submitted in the chat. Thank you for that I want to pose to our panelists. The question is about Gen Z and how they've been a political force in recent elections, both in the midterms and then this Georgia runoff election that went for Senator Warnock. What might be the political pathway back to a new version of Roe or a different version of Roe for Gen Z and, of course, for the rest of us as well?
I'm a huge fan of Gen Z. Oh boy. They are fired up about a lot of issues, including climate change and this issue, and that's across male and female and everybody in Gen Z. It's just really exciting, and so the path is not necessarily having to go all the way through the courts again. It is a democracy. We can pass legislation, and in fact, the House of Representatives had passed the Women's Health Protection Act back in 2021, and then the Senate failed to be able to take it up and do anything with it. That would have basically essentially, I'm simplifying, but codified Roe. And but the rules in the Senate, first of all, we didn't have much of the Democrats didn't have much of a majority in the Senate, and probably you'd have to overcome the filibuster unless you waive that somehow. So I don't, though that is like a path, a legislative path is possible, and that will take a concerted, effort to make happen, but it is possible, and we wouldn't have to wait 50 years if we work together to make it happen.
Yeah, I just echo that. I think that the political activism is needed, because the courts have shown that they frankly can't be trusted with these issues, and I think that we have to now be prepared to fight. And what's frightening for me is that even in those states where they just overturned or voted against abortion bans, those states are trying different tactics to, maybe it's not statewide, maybe it's countywide, maybe it's, citywide. And so I think we have to be prepared, and Gen Z, should be prepared, in the schools and the workplaces where they are, to be strong advocates for expanding abortion rights and reproductive freedom. And I think I'm pretty confident we can count on a majority of them, not all of them, but a significant majority of them.
We have a question from Jill Wagner. So Jill, go ahead and ask your question whenever you have your camera on and whenever you are unmuted.
There we go. How's that?
Sounds great. We can hear you, Jill. Thank you.
Okay, I'm a MPA2 from back in the day, and my question is, and I don't want to go to the legal aspect of it, but it's really the question of self-determination. I don't hear that as part of this argument, self-determination is in international law, it's in our state and federal law, but I don't hear it even being part of the discussion of this topic. So I didn't know if there's something there that I'm missing or I haven't read.
Thank you so much for the question.
Yeah, I think I started out kind of touching on that when, going way back to a document that I wasn't really included in, which is the Declaration of Independence, which talks about life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness. And I think that that's where we're getting at the issues of self-determination, and that this is a human right. And we're talking about the rights of humans to bodily autonomy, and free will. And so, but in terms, so, and again, I think that some of the laws that we've seen are getting at that, and the fact that you have the courts and politicians who want to control personal aspects of human, not just their reproductive health, their sexual health, that criminalizing and thinking about what's happening at Children's Hospital here in Boston, where they provide life-saving care to transgender youth. So I think the whole issue of bodily autonomy and human rights is one that I know the Planned Parenthood organizations are focused on. But I'd be interested, Jill, in any more that you think we should be focusing on in this area.
Well, I just add that to me, the concept of self-determination is defined by a patriarchal or male construct and does not necessarily include us women. And, as was said earlier, the role of motherhood and all of those obligations. So to me, self-determination is a construct that we need to really address.
I agree with that. And I would also add, while I'm not a legal scholar, one of the things that this issue brought to light is that the right to an abortion isn't a single right. Like, it's a Jenga tower of rights that are all interwoven together, and the case law here is complicated. And again, I'm not a scholar, but like, it's really tethered to ideas of privacy as opposed to autonomy, or as you put it, self-determination. So even from a legal paradigm kind of perspective, I think that's an opportunity. This has actually been a huge lesson for me in the imprecision of the law. And it actually comes down to a thought I was having as we were thinking about how to counsel Gen Z, which was that, the Kennedy School is a school of public policy, but it also has an aperture on public service that's broader than public policy. And reproduction and autonomy and how they intersect is like existential, which means that we all have a stake in it. And Loretta Ross, who coined the term reproductive justice, reflected to me about, I asked her how she maintains optimism. She's in her 70s, and was there for the Roe decision and the Dobbs decision. And she said something which I think is worth quoting directly, which is that she says she often tells young people, that's how she put it, Gen Z or young people, not to imagine themselves as the whole chain of freedom, that they're not responsible for what their ancestors did or what their descendants will do, but their job is to make sure that the chain doesn't break at their link, and that when the world is a mess, you should grab a broom and clean where you are. And I think that is really wise advice, because there's a lot that we have to do to build a solution. We need better policy, we need better legal theories, we also need better services fundamentally and better infrastructure. Anyway, we all have a role to play.
I love that, and I'll use that as a bridge to my next question, which is one of the ones that was pre-submitted. Before we go there, if anybody else who's on here live would like to ask a question, I remind you to please use the hand raise function in Zoom, and Kristen will then pick you up. But one of the pre-submitted questions was, what can an individual do? An individual who is not a healthcare practitioner, who is not a lawyer, and who is not a publicly elected official.
Oh, there are so many things, and I think we're going to share some resources after this session. There are organizations that are longstanding, like Planned Parenthood, which has both a nonprofit and a political action component. Wanda can speak more about that, but so many others that are kind of springing up to try and also deal like within certain states selectively to work with employers, to really try and bridge through these trying times to get women access to the abortion medication by mail, for example, and just to educate more people beyond what Planned Parenthood is already doing. So there's a lot of energy around this that you can be a volunteer for, contribute to, et cetera. But I'm still a fan of political action and making this a non-negotiable part of a candidate's platform in terms of, who you choose to support and what you do to get out the vote and all of those kind of things. That's just fundamental and has to remain extremely front and center. So it's choosing your candidates carefully and I think working with organizations that are trying to do some of the on the ground work in other states, like they did so effectively in Kansas. And there were definitely out of state dollars and volunteers who kind of hit the ground and worked, spent months on this ballot initiative. Those are just a few thoughts.
Yeah, and I tend to go towards the political activism as well, even though for Planned Parenthood, I am on the 501c3, so that's not the political arm of the organization. But I think of organizations, broadly, like the New Georgia Coalition that is knocking on doors, and they knocked on over 2 million doors this election cycle. And I heard them speak this summer, and they talked about starting those kinds of coalitions all over the country, but particularly in what they said described as the former Confederate states. But I think every state has, could benefit from having that level of activism on the ground, engaging people, listening to people. I think that's a big piece of their strategy, to hear what the desires and needs are of the population.
I'm going to jump in because there's also the corporate side. And so anybody who can speak up in a company, be on a board, I think Wanda and I we were talking earlier about, don't let this fall into, oh, that's political, so we can't touch that. This needs to be much broader based. And I think that there is a role to play in corporate America in terms of elevating the issue. And, and then, yes, it delves into the political realm, but, where are you sending your kids to college? And what kind of, what state is that in? And do you make a statement with that? Where do you have a corporate headquarters? Where do you have a conference? Do you go to the, there's a lot to consider here, and to, be a voice.
I think the best thing along those lines that an individual can do is influence institutions, honestly. And that may include the institutions that you're a part of, even if they're not overtly political ones. Also, this is a controversial take. A lot of our existing institutions failed us on this issue, including the ones that were supposed to be the stalwarts on the front lines of it, because we are where we are. And, it's hard to be a public health organization and a political organization and a care delivery organization at the same time. So build new ones. That's what Kennedy School students do and alumni do. Create alternatives. But, and also, like, progress doesn't require consensus. It requires a simultaneity of response. It requires everybody doing something, but not necessarily all doing it in the same way.
Thank you. We have one more question from Howard Merkowitz. Howard, go ahead. Thank you in advance for your question.
Thanks, Howard Merkowitz, MPP, a very long time ago again. So it's great that Massachusetts has a non-extradition law, but what about doctors or others who assist in providing abortions here, who travel to states that don't have non-extradition laws, or who prosecute those who assist in abortions? Are they also at risk? And isn't the only solution for that a national right to abortion law?
Yes. Yeah, I mean, it's a scary time to be a clinician, and it's not straightforward to create a solution for people that exist in these reproductive health deserts that involves remote access or people coming in to help. It's very complicated, but it's not clear that the protections in place are enough to be truly protective. Yes, we need a fundamentally different approach.
Right. So as Rosemarie mentioned, in conferences, if you go to a conference in a state that doesn't have these protections and Texas goes after you, then I assume you're also at risk, right?
It's even more complicated than that because of the aiding and abetting part of it.
You're aiding and
Yeah. So
abetting.
if you're an employer, there were some prominent employers with footprints in Texas that went on the record in the news about what they were going to do to reimburse travel or whatever the case might be, which is aiding and abetting, and all of them are targets for theoretically for felonies, which is like absurd, but theoretically how the law is written and could be the basis of, like I said, an activist DA making a point.
Thank you for that question, Howard. In the interest of time, I want to give each of our three panelists a chance to say a final word and leave all of our watchers and listeners with a final takeaway. So if we could keep these to around 30 seconds or so, that would be wonderful. Wanda, let's start with you.
My final word is that this is a human rights issue, and at the fundamental level, and we need to continue to fight for human rights.
Thank you so much. Neel, go ahead.
My final word is that I'm honored to be here with Rosemarie and Wanda. And I think also maybe, as Rosemarie reminded me during the prep, here to represent, I think, the allyship part of this too. And honestly, like I'm a relatively late comer to this issue in realizing its importance and even my own agency in doing something about it. So I hope, I think a big part of what we need is more leadership, but also more allyship.
Thank you, Neel. And Rosemarie, please.
I love both of those comments. I think to build on, I love, Neel, what you said about progress doesn't require consensus. I was going to say that you never have to have everyone. You have to have just enough. And that was something that inspired me right before the midterms this year. A member of Congress who was in a toughly contested, a newly elected woman, was saying, these are scary times, but we won't convince everyone. There will be people who think the insurrection was right, or whatever. But if you can have just enough people, we can protect democracy, and we can, and then by extension, rights like this. And so that's what I think we need to be part of the just enough.
Thank you so much, Rosemarie, Wanda, and Neel, for your incredible insights and for this fantastic conversation. And thank you to all of you who have joined us live today and who will be watching this on recording later. It's been really a pleasure. I wish you all a merry and safe holiday season, and I'm turning it back to Karen to conclude.
Yes, just to echo Siri's comments and just to say thank you. Thank you so much for the panelists for this very important discussion, and to thank you for all the alumni who joined us. We look forward to keeping you engaged in future months. And for the most up-to-date school news and events, please visit us on the HKS website, alumni website. So happy holidays, everyone. And thank you all so much for your time. We really appreciate it.